Hello everyone, this will be chapter 17 of Regular Boy Daniel Wayne, written by Diamond Rosie and read by Insect Overlord. This chapter is titled Wes's Celebrity Crush. Danny watched with awe as the plains of nothing bled into the buildings that now surrounded them, getting taller and grander. He'd been in Gotham for almost a week now, but the only time he'd left the manor was when he went to school. Not that he minded, exploring the manor had been an adventure enough to satiate him for the time being, but Metropolis was nothing like a midi park. There were crowds of people walking around in the downtown area, and the people slowly lessened as the cars increased on their way deeper into the city. Danny could spot the tall building with Daily Planet inscribed on the rotating globe on its roof, even though they were still pretty far. Danny wondered if he would spot Superman dashing around in the sky. "You're leaning," Jason chastised lightly. "Sorry," Danny straightened in his seat. "First time in the big city?" Jason teased. "Kinda, yeah," Danny admitted shyly. Jason's helmet inched towards him. "Wait, for real? No one's taken you through Gotham yet?" Genuine surprise laced his words. Danny shrugged, comfortably leaning on Jason's wide back. He pushed his visor up to watch the people of the city. The ride had started off in organized conversation and slowly tapered into a comfortable silence. They talked about the small stuff, like music and hobbies, sure, but that wasn't what Danny needed to know. Danny was certain Jason was a bad affiliate, even if he wasn't sure which one. Jason told Danny stories of his new brothers and the trouble they got into when Bruce wasn't looking. Maybe Danny wouldn't have thought anything of them, but knowing that they were Nightwing, Red Robin, Current Robin, and so on, gave Danny a clue that Jason was trying to cover up a much bigger picture. Considering that Jason had died at one point, it made the most sense that he was the second Robin who'd been murdered by the Joker. Danny suspected Jason may not be aware of his ghostliness as Danny was. But the drive had proven something else to Danny. Much more valuable than knowing which Gotham vigilante Jason was knowing where his allegiances lied for the crown. Ghosts were not creatures of deceit. Naturally, there were exceptions, but Danny was confident Jason wasn't one of them. He'd had many opportunities to corner Danny during the drive through the cornfields and expanses of farmlands on their drive, where the only witnesses would have been the occasional cow. But it seemed not to have even crossed his mind. Ghosts were never the type to hide their cards when they had the opportunity to strike. They were always eager to bare their fangs, only sometimes metaphorically. After all, fighting is one of the most common pastimes in the realms. For ghosts, power showed status, and status was respect and honor. Ghosts were always easier to understand than humans, and between the two, Danny found one much easier to trust than the other. Being able to pass his weight onto Jason's unbudging shoulders was a comfort Danny hadn't experienced since he was little. The city passed by in a beautiful blur, and Danny kept his eyes peeled for the famous Kryptonian. He was disappointed, but not surprised to not see the big blue before the cement ceiling of the parking deck obscured the sky. Storing both their helmets away, Danny followed behind Jason into a fancy lobby in the building far too tall for Danny to see the title of. "Hello," the attendant greeted when they approached them with a pleasant smile. "What can I help you with?" "We had an appointment with Clark Kent," Jason told the attendant. Danny took in the magnificent stairway that led into the offices and the array of people in fine suits. Jason looked at the elevator just as it dinged open. "Looks like Mr. Kent is ready for you," the attendant said with a small laugh, looking at a large man approaching them from the elevator. When the man finally met them at the desk, the attendant returned to her work with just small pleasantries. "Jason!" the man greeted cheerfully, going in for a warm hug. "Hey, Clark," Jason managed in the crushing grip. Mr. Kent turned to Danny, releasing Jason. "You must be Danny. Bruce has already told me a lot about you." He stuck out his hand to shake. "I'm Clark Kent." His bright and genuine demeanor was a stark contrast to the cloud of death that hovered around him. Danny didn't remember ever seeing one as dark and heavy as the one attached to this man. "He spoke pretty highly of you, too. Nice to meet you, Mr. Kent." Danny hoped he hadn't stared too long, trying to smooth over the interaction with a nice handshake. Danny eyed the man more closely. There was something different about him. Danny could feel Mr. Kent control his strength when he shook hands with him. Danny had a feeling this man was not entirely human, not ghostly or of the realms. Maybe an alien. "Please, Clark is just fine," he said distractedly, his eyebrows scrunched as he watched Danny carefully. "Are you feeling all right, Danny?" Concern was heavy in his voice. Jason's head swiveled at Danny. "Yeah?" Danny answered, confused. "I guess I'm a little nervous." That wasn't the answer Clark had wanted. "Danny, if you're feeling unwell, we should go to the hospital," he said seriously, hands coming out like he was ready to catch Danny. "We can reschedule the interview." "Danny?" Jason asked, stepping closer as well. "I don't need to go to the hospital." Danny looked between the two men, confused, nerves dancing in his stomach. "I feel fine." Clark glanced over at Jason with a meaningful look. Jason stared back in all the confusion Danny was feeling. "Let's head to my office," he said pointedly. "Okay?" Danny nodded, sticking closer to Jason as they headed into the elevator. "You sure nothing's up?" Jason asked quietly, leading in to whisper in Danny's ear. "Yes," he hissed back. "Are you sure this guy's not completely—" He made a cuckoo sign. Clark stiffened at the comment, like he was forcing himself not to react. The elevator was quite large, with Clark standing almost at the other end of Jason and Danny. Danny had spoken too quietly for Jason to have been able to hear what he'd said if he hadn't had his ear right next to Danny, but somehow Clark had heard him. Danny remembered the doctor's visit with Bruce a few days ago. His lower-than-average heart rate, attributed to his meta-status by Dr. Tompkins. Danny glanced over at the man nervously fidgeting next to him. Did Clark have super hearing? The elevator dung as it went another floor up. Danny weighed his options. Danny stopped his heart. In his human form, he could do it for only a few minutes at a time before his body started feeling the effects. Clark's head snapped in his direction. "Danny!" Jason only responded seconds later. "What?" he asked, alarmed, looking the boy up and down for any signs. Danny let his heart return to its usual pace. "You have super hearing," he concluded. Clark spluttered unconvincingly. "What? No, I don't." He laughed nervously, about to turn the conversation back to Danny. Danny decided to clear the air before the elevator exposed them to the public. "I'm a meta," he said, showing the ice crystallizing over his outstretched hand. "Lowered heart rate kinda comes with the territory," he shrugged. "Super strength, super hearing, alien, Metropolis. Close trusted friend of Bruce, aka Batman. Looks like Danny got to meet Superman after all." The elevator doors swung open. Jason laughed in both relief and annoyance. "Seriously? Didn't Bruce tell you about that?" He lowered his voice, a very conspicuous whisper. "Powers," before looking around obviously and trying to act casual for the rest of the conversation. But not the, again to whisper, heart rate. Jason blinked at Clark's attempt at subtlety. "Sorry about the scare, big guy." Danny tried not to laugh when Jason patted Clark on the arm consolingly as they finally made it to the room marked Kent on the outside. Clark took a moment to collect himself in the chair behind the desk, his brows scrunched in confusion as he turned to Danny again. Crap. Having ice powers and stopping your heart didn't exactly go hand in hand. How was Danny going to sell this? "Bruce spoke highly of me?" Clark asked, voice touched. Danny blinked at him. Yeah." Confused why that was brought up again. Jason snorted a laugh next to him. "He said he really trusted you, and that you were one of his closest friends," Danny added after a moment. He said I was his close friend, Clark said to himself as if he had won the lottery. A knock at the door interrupted them. Come in. Hey, Clark. A short, fierce-looking woman entered. Hello, boys. She smiled at Danny and Jason easily. Hey, Lois. Hi, Lois. Clark smiled. Lois Lane. Wes's inspiration, idol, and celebrity crush all wrapped into a neat package of a pastel pink pantsuit with black stilettos. Had Danny read every single one of her articles to be published? Yes. Had he sat through lengthy explanations on why she was the best journalist to walk the earth? Yes. Was it voluntary? No, it was not. The mythological woman turned to Danny with a smile. Wes was so going to lose his mind. You must be Danny. She reached out her hand to shake. I'm Lois Lane. Nice to meet you, Miss Lane. I heard a lot about your work, he said honestly. My friend's a huge fan of yours. Miss Lane smiled, flattered. Your friend has a great taste, she laughed. And please, Lois is just fine. I do hope Clark isn't making you too nervous. Jason spoke up this time. We were just doing some icebreakers. Clark chuckled at that, because he cut himself off, turning to Lois almost robotically. For no particular reason. His voice was completely devoid of its earlier humor. Danny looked over to Jason, both cringing in second-hand embarrassment. Lois, to her credit, had no reaction to Clark's attempt of subtlety. Well, Danny, you have a pretty high-profile interview lined up today. Have you ever done an interview before? I've done a job interview, Danny tried. Lois gave him an encouraging smile. It's not too different from that. I'm sure you've seen other celebrity interviews. It'll be like that. Try not to be too nervous. We'll try to make it as comfortable as possible, Clark assured, filtering through a file. Are you comfortable in front of a camera? Yeah, Danny nodded easily, the memories of 12-year-old Jazz forcing Danny to make vlogs with her resurfacing. Okay, that's great, Clark smiled, more professionally now. Lois took her turn to speak. Bruce told us about your meta abilities. Are you comfortable being public about it, or would you like to keep it a secret? Danny considered his options. He had only spent a week in the manor, which was a week since dinner his meta powers were exposed. At first, Danny had been terrified of the possible repercussions, but everyone had been surprisingly nonchalant about it. Except for Duke, he was very chalant. It was refreshing to be able to use his powers with little thought, even if it was only a sliver of them. Danny owed it to Duke, and every other meta for that matter. I don't mind people knowing, he decided. Clark nodded. Here's all the questions we've prepared. If there's any of them you aren't comfortable answering, you can mark them off or edit them how you see fit. He slid Danny a small packet. Jason busied himself on his phone while Danny read through all the questions. In 3, 2, 1. The light signaled they were recording lit red. Hello and welcome to the Daily Planet. I'm reporter Clark Kent here with Lois Lane. Lois and Clark were sitting on 2 chairs next to each other on the set. A cityscape backdrop behind them. Danny sat on a 3rd chair, currently out of frame. He'd changed into the suit Bruce had sent out earlier and fiddled with the cuffs nervously, periodically glancing over to Jason behind the camera. Thank you, Clark, Lois said gracefully. About a month ago, there was a startling discovery of Dr. Kyle's illegal and unsanctioned research conducted on non-consenting families. Dr. Kyle was a renowned gynecologist when his research was discovered by Gotham's Nightwing and Batman. The doctor, employed at West Gotham General Hospital for all 26 years of his so-called experimentation as one of the lead obstetricians, was guilty of swapping 568 babies under his care. Due to his esteemed reputation, many of Dr. Kyle's patients were high profile. One of such patients was Clara King, former wife of Bruce Wayne. 16 years ago, they sorrowfully announced to the public the loss of their long-awaited child and subsequently the annulment of their marriage. Mrs. King has not made any public appearances since the marriage was broken off. During the investigation of Dr. Kyle's victims, one of them was found to be the child they had supposedly lost 16 years ago. As I'm sure all of our viewers are aware of the title of this video, this is an interview. Danny took a breath as the camera panned to invite him into the frame. Today, we have with us Daniel Wayne, formerly thought to be the son of Doctors Madeline and Jack Fenton. Lois turned away from the camera she had been speaking to, as she and Clark faced Danny. Jason gave Danny an encouraging thumbs up from across the room, as Clark took his cue to enter Danny into the conversation. "Well, Mr. Wayne, it's a pleasure to have you on with us today." "Pleasure to be here." Danny smiled at him, sitting pristinely in his chair. The teen had said he was okay with the camera, but his ability to conduct himself so professionally at such a young age still impressed Clark. "Danny's fine. Mr. Wayne's kinda weird," he joked lightly. Clark noticed the stiffness in his jaw as he spoke. "Of course, I'm sure it'll take some getting used to." Clark tried to ease. "I can't help but ask, how does it feel to find out you're the son of one of the richest men in America?" Danny laughed politely at Clark's description. "Well, it definitely wasn't on my bucket list, that's for sure." Lois offered him a smile at that. Honestly, the whole experience was bizarre. I don't think I've still totally wrapped my head around it. Growing up, I'd say we were somewhere in the middle of upper middle class. We were pretty well off, but compared to that, everything here is just so..." Danny paused to find the word. "Grand. It's very grand." "There's a lot that comes with the territory, I'm sure." Lois nodded, taking a quick glance at her cue card. "Wayne is an elusive name, and a lot of the public will want to get to know you." Danny nodded. "So, let's kick off the interview portion, if you're ready." "As I'll ever be." Danny's smile was more of a grimace. Clark tried to give him a comforting look. "We'll start off with the basics." Clark smiled. "How old are you?" 16. "And your birthday?" "February 12th. Danny seemed to get more comfortable as the questions continued. "Favorite food?" Lois asked. "Anything that's not toast and edible." Clark blinked at the response. Maybe it was some strange teenager lingo. Connor was always using strange terms and phrases. Lois, ever the professional, was undeterred by the answer. "You said you grew up mostly middle to upper class. Can you tell us more about what it was like growing up?" "Well, my parents..." Clark wondered if Danny's hesitation at that word was because of nerves or something else. "Were usually pretty busy with their research and stuff, so growing up they put me and my sister in a lot of extracurriculars. But other than that," Danny shrugged lightly, "I just hung out with my friends and went to school, I guess. There's not exactly a lot to do in middle of nowhere, Illinois." Clark had grown familiar with Danny's heart rate during their pre-interview process, but the slight irregularity of the heart rate told Clark he was lying, or hiding something. Clark let it slide. It probably wasn't anything criminalizing, just regular teenager activity, whatever that was. Looking at his cue card, Clark saw the question, "What kind of research did your parents do?" marked out with a large "Do not ask," one of the few ones that Danny had marked off. Clark figured it was fair enough. Danny might not have been too involved in it to know exactly what his parents did. Most of Bruce's kids knew nothing about his day job, despite their tenacious need to be over-informed on any matter. "What extracurriculars did you do?" Clark asked instead. "Or what were your favorites?" he amended. "I mostly did a lot of sports. My sister did artsy stuff like piano and violin and stuff. She would always try to drag me into them with her. Piano wasn't too bad, I guess," Danny said offhandedly, before a genuine smile crept onto his face. "My favorite was definitely hockey. I like soccer too. It's more accessible since all you really need is just a ball, as opposed to ice skates and all that stuff. I've tried a bunch of sports, but those are definitely my favorites." "Did you play competitively?" Lois asked, easily noticing Danny's passion for the sports. "I used to." Danny's smile faltered. "I had to take a break for a while because of health reasons." The excitement from before returned twofold. "But I went to the doc the other day with Bruce. I'm all clear to play now." He huffed proudly at the last part. Danny was quite charming. Clark could already tell the public would take to him nicely. "We can't wait to see you on the ice." Clark smiled, Danny's excitement rubbing off on him. "Speaking of ice," Lois said delicately, "I've been told you're a meta." "That's right," Danny nodded. His excitement had melted away, but he was more comfortable in his seat than he was when they first started. Danny's shoulders were relaxed, and his chin was forward in silent confidence. To be public about his meta-status was a huge step for Danny to take, especially for someone not used to the pandering reporters he was bound to face. The Meta-Human Rights Act was passed almost 11 years ago, but there was still a stigma surrounding it. Ironically, those who used their powers publicly to help were idolized, while those who kept it to themselves were vilified and thought less of. The law stepped in when it could, but most of the behavior against metas was still not taken seriously. Trafficking rings running rampant in almost every major city. "If you're comfortable, can you show us some of your abilities?" Lois asked, going off script as she often did. "Sure," Danny said, taking a moment to think before a boyish grin broke his air of professionalism. "Okay, there's this one I've been practicing. It's a pretty cool party trick." Clark, Lois, and the set crew watched Danny in anticipation. He took a careful breath, holding it for a few seconds before turning towards the camera. A puff of chilled air left him, and a delicate snowflake danced in the air, large enough that its detailed intricacies were easily caught by all the onlookers. The looks and whispers of awe echoed through the room, embarrassing their performer. "That was amazing," Clark said honestly, not able to stop himself from leaning forward to touch the ice crystal as it drifted towards the floor. It vanished after Clark let it go. "I'm curious, is there a reason that you decided to be so public about your meta-status?" Clark prompted. Danny considered his words carefully before speaking. "I feel like most people, when they find out a person is meta, expect them to, do something amazing. The Justice League, the Young Justice League, the Teen Titans, and all the other hero teams are full of metas. And I think a lot of people feel pressured to do more than their peers just because of their meta-ness, which is honestly unfair. Meta or not, a person is just a person, and they shouldn't be pushed into a role they think might not fit. It takes a lot to be a hero, and I think it's okay for not everyone to be one. And that's who I am. Just a regular guy that happens to be a meta." He paused. "Well, I was regular," Danny laughed lightly before continuing. "And although there are a lot of metas that are heroes, not every hero is a meta, and not every meta has to be a hero. Batman, Robin, and all their friends, they don't need powers to help," he concluded. Clark heard Jason give a small offended huff at being grouped in with all their friends. "That's quite contradictory," Lois commented. "I suspect you might have become a hero just by not being one." Danny rubbed his neck in embarrassment. "That's a very eloquent response," Clark praised. "I'm sure our viewers are curious as well. You've mentioned you enjoyed hockey. Does that in any way tie to your affinity for ice?" "Well, I only found out I was a meta when I was around 13, which, Danny hesitated, was when I couldn't really play." At Danny's reaction, Clark decided he wouldn't pursue the topic any longer. "I played a bit with my old teammates back in a midi when the lake would freeze over. Honestly, the only actual difference is I don't get a cold as easily." Danny tried to go for a casual laugh. A bit off topic, Lois picked up on Danny's uncomfortableness with the topic as well. "What made you decide to move in with Bruce?" "Honestly, it just kind of worked out that way. My parents' boss were having them move out of the country for work, which coincidentally was the same time I found out about Bruce. And, well, Gotham is a lot closer to home than the Caribbean," Danny said easily, happy to leave the topic behind. Danny was clearly unwelcoming to the discussion of how his powers activated, which was not necessarily concerning on its own, but compiled with the aforementioned health problems led to some unsavory conclusions. Clark would have to discuss it with Bruce later. You mentioned that you enjoyed sports, but are there any academic subjects that interest you? Honestly, school's always been kind of boring to me. I guess if I had to pick astronomy and maybe physics. Astronomy? Like the study of space? Danny nodded in confirmation. Then I suppose you would know a lot about the planets. Do you have a favorite? A favorite? Danny repeated, surprised. He said thoughtfully before looking up directly into Clark's eyes. The look wasn't intense, and Clark couldn't sense any hidden meaning behind the look. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that Danny was seeing a lot more than he was letting on. Like his bluish-gray eyes were a vortex sucking in all the tells Clark himself wasn't aware of. Like a bucket of ice had been poured over him, Clark remembered that the boy across from him was not just Bruce Wayne's son. He was also the son of Batman, the world's greatest detective, and the grandson of the Demon's Head, Ra's al Ghul, and the son of his heir, Talia al Ghul. Maybe Pluto, Danny answered, after having divulged all of Clark's secrets from under him. Pluto's not a planet, Lois remarked, shuffling to the last card without looking at the deck. Danny gave an affronted gasp. Pluto is too a planet, he insisted indignantly. Lois laughed lightly at the behavior and let it slide. I believe we're at the last question of the day, she announced, glancing at her cue card. Instead of asking the question written on there, she did a double take, brows scrunching in confusion. Clark leaned over to get a look at the card. What's wrong? Danny asked, confused. Connor must have gotten a hold of these, she chastised the boy, even though he wasn't present. Someone left the interview questions on the dining table again. Lois gave Clark a sharp look. Clark looked away with a grimace. Jason laughed quietly in the background. How bad could it be? I don't even know what that means, she mumbled, holding the card up that read, Do you? She squinted. Mew? Danny blinked at her, processing the statement before laughter burst out of him. Danny was exhausted by the time he and Jason walked back to the bike. The night had set in around them, and the city was just as busy as it had been when they arrived. "Want to go grab a bite?" Jason asked, passing Danny his helmet. Fortunately, Clark had said he would send the suit back later, and Danny was free to wear his much more comfortable clothes. "Yeah," Danny sighed. "I'm starving. I know a burger place not too far from here." There was a comfortable hum of conversation in the clean diner Jason had brought them to. Well, it was cleaner than Nasty Burger, which, in retrospect, was a pretty low bar. In the booth they shared, there was a tray of 5 warm burgers and an order of fries and a drink, each between Danny and Jason. "So, how do you think it went?" Jason prompted, lifting the burger from his meal. "Not bad," Danny shrugged. "It was a lot more casual than I thought it would be." Danny flopped a fry into his sauce repeatedly without taking a bite. Jason sipped at his soda. "Something's still bothering you, though." Danny looked up at the tray of fries to face Jason. The attentiveness in the way Jason looked at him expectantly, but without pressure, was still an unfamiliar feeling to Danny. Danny had made sure that he answered the questions with an uncaring casualness, so that the knot of nerves in his gut stay hidden. Was Danny easy to read, or was Jason actually genuinely paying attention to him? Before Danny had the chance to figure out what exactly was wrong, or why the ball of nerves in his stomach still hadn't untangled, Jason spoke. "You know, if there is one thing any of us have learned, it's not to give a crap about what the internet thinks. Anyone who's ever been in the same room as Bruce always gets analyzed and scrutinized. Just 'cause those little asses like to pretend they know all about what's going down. They don't. And you don't need to act like they do." Jason looked at Danny in the eye. "You got that?" Danny stared at Jason. How had he known what to say before Danny even knew what he wanted to hear? The silence stretched for a while. "Yeah," he croaked. "Thanks." Jason shoved Danny's shin with the hard toe of his boot under the table. Danny huffed and threw a fry in his face in retaliation. Jason cursed Danny lightly under his breath as he wiped the oil off his forehead. The action ruffled the white tuft of hair that lined his soft window peak. Jason knew very well what that white hair meant, but he remembered his earlier suspicion that Jason might not entirely know. It was actually quite common for ghosts not to know they had died, and when you weren't dead all the time, it wasn't exactly the easiest conclusion. Danny internally debated whether or not he should ask. "Spit it out, kid," Jason said lightly, munching on a fry. Danny was unsure how to broach the topic. "I mean your hair. How come there's just a chunk of it that's white?" Topics related to death were always sensitive for the dead, and many refused to even talk about it. Most took it in great offense. Jason seemed surprised by the question, hand going to fiddle with the colorless strands. "Dunno, it just turned white one day," he shrugged. Danny tried to read if Jason was telling the truth or if he just didn't want to tell Danny. "I tried to dye it back, but the color never sticks to it." "I had a friend back in Amity whose hair was like that too." Danny nodded at Jason's explanation, hoping this little lie would be believable. Jason hummed as he spoke. "Well, he wasn't exactly alive, though." "What?" Jason said, disbelieving. So he really didn't know. "I mean, my parents were ghost researchers. I was bound to meet some." Danny shrugged lightly. "And you were friends with them." Jason enunciated every sound as if to chastise Danny. Danny peered at him. "Just 'cause they're dead doesn't make them subhuman." "That's not what I meant," Jason backtracked. "Anyway, my point. One of my friends used to have black hair like yours when he, was alive, but it turned white after he died. And, well, you did kind of publicly die, so I just figured—" Danny trailed off in favor of taking another bite of his burger. Jason considered his words. "Your friend got a name?" "Phantom." Danny made sure his voice was even. "Why?" "How'd you know that he looked like this before he died?" Jason asked instead. The look in his eyes told Danny he already knew the answer. Danny raised a brow instead of answering, not wanting to contradict whatever conclusion Jason had come up with. "That's not the point. We're talking about you." Danny pointed a limp fry at him, sauce dripping onto the table. "I'm not talking about you," Jason countered easily. The feeling from earlier returned, but Danny shoved it away. There was an obvious concern in his eyes as Jason leaned in, as if to be closer to him. "Danny," Jason started easily. Were you there when your friend died?" Danny blinked, not expecting that question. Danny wasn't sure why he answered honestly. "I guess so." He shrugged. He didn't want Jason to know he was talking about his alter ego just yet. "Shoot, Danny." Jason leaned back in his chair, forearms resting on the rim of the table. Danny couldn't decipher what the emotion Jason's whole body seemed to express was, but a solemn air hung over him. Danny wondered how exactly Jason had been interpreting this conversation. I guess I did die," Jason finally answered Danny's original question. "But only technically." "Technically?" Danny questioned disbelievingly. "You had a whole funeral and everything." "The technically," Jason said snidely, "being that I'm not dead anymore." Danny knew there had to be more to the story, but he decided not to push the matter. He was surprised when Jason spoke up after the chattering group of teenagers a few tables down. "I was dead for 6 months," Jason whispered lowly. Danny almost missed it. "I'm not really sure how it happened, if I'm being honest. I died, and the next thing I know, I'm digging myself out of my grave. Like something out of a zombie flick, and I'm completely out of my mind. Jason hesitated, like he was debating adding a certain detail. "Someone found me, one of Batman's rogues." Danny made sure not to react to that. "And they dunked me in this murky green water thing, and I guess I was a little more alive after that." Green water thing made him think a little more alive sounded suspiciously like ectoplasm, though the murky part was a bit concerning. Problem for future Danny. Jason looked away from Danny after a short explanation. busying himself with slurping the remains of his drink. "That's kind of what happened to my friend, too." Danny nodded comfortingly, cleaning up the side of the table. "Except the 6 months part. Not really sure how long he was dead for, but it definitely wasn't 6 months. I guess I'm just an overachiever," Jason huffed, shoulders relaxing when Danny didn't prod for more information. Danny rolled his eyes as they walked to the door. Maybe Phantom ought to pay Jason a visit soon. "Danny," Jason called lightly as the night breeze chilled the air, turning to look at him outside the glass door of the diner. "Bruce," he sighed, picking his words carefully. "He has this thing about not telling people things until the last possible moment." Danny blinked at him. "It's his way of trying to protect you," Jason said, obviously in disagreement with the concept. He didn't elaborate, and Danny got a sense that he wasn't supposed to ask more. Danny wasn't sure what Jason was talking about, but he nodded at the information anyway. "Okay?" Confusion was obvious in his tone, but Jason didn't elaborate. They walked in pace to where Jason left the bike, when Danny took the chance and grabbed the driver's seat before Jason could. "I'll drive," he declared. "No way, kid," Jason denied instantly, grabbing the handle of the bike. "Do you even know how to drive this thing?" "Yes," Danny crossed his arms indignantly. "Johnny taught me." "Who's Johnny?" Jason raised a brow, their heights even since Danny was sitting on the bike while Jason stood on the ground. "A friend of mine." "You have a lot of friends," Danny laughed. "What can I say?" "Wait," Jason looked at him. "This Johnny guy, is he a ghost too?" "Yeah," Danny nodded, confused why Jason sounded so scandalized. "You learned how to ride from a dead guy?" "Okay, if you put it like that, what other way is there to put it?" Jason threw his hands in the air. "You know," Danny drawled, remembering the conversation Tucker's parents had with them once, "I'm probably going to do this anyway, so would you rather be there for when I do it or not?" He gave Jason a challenging look. Jason looked at him, appalled. "You're definitely Bruce's kid," he concluded with a huff, pulling his helmet on. After a thorough 45-minute lesson on what every single button did, and every standard safety maneuver, Jason hesitantly crawled onto the back of the bike. Unfortunately, Danny only lasted 15 minutes before Jason forced him to pull over because, apparently, it was too obvious that he learned from a guy who wasn't worried about dying a second time. Whatever that meant. Twitter, Daily Planet. Check out our latest video interview with a surprise guest. Link. 5 minutes later. Wes, 3 missed calls. Wes, Danny. Wes, Daniel. Wes, no effing way I'm finding out like this. Wes, Lois Lane? Wes, you were interviewed by the Lois Lane? Wes, and this is how I find out? Wes, F you. You're main man. Wes, Twitter link, Daily Planet. Check out our latest video interview with a surprise guest. Link. Wes, at Danny. 15 minutes later. Your main man. Tucker. Dude. Val, you told them you're a meta? Sam, WTF, Danny? Wes, I mean, it's passable. No one's gonna question that, especially after the snowflake thing. Tucker, the snowflake was dope AF. Val, no it wasn't. Tucker, but that was still a risky move. Danny, typing. This concludes Chapter 17 of Regular Boy Daniel Wayne. I hope you liked this one. The next one should be up soon, probably next week, and thank you so much for listening.